back in here. Can everybody see this okay?
You can move that table over just a little bit.
It's always a pleasure to talk to requesters. Actually, this is the third time I've done this, and I think it's quite remarkable because most people don't ask me to come back a second time. But, the first time was at Ann and Jim's house when they were living over in North Little Rock. Second time was also at Ann and Jim's house after they had moved into Little Rock over on Arch Street. And when I heard we were coming down to Bryant today, I thought, good Lord, they moved again. But I want to do something a little different tonight, other than talk about a collection or something. I wanted to talk to you, tell you a story that has to do with restoration and preservation. This is the restoration and preservation of an airplane. I'm going to break the story up into two parts. The first part is how this particular airplane came to be, this particular type of airplane came to be in the first place. And the second part, we'll talk about one particular airplane. And I think you all can relate to this pretty well, because really a complicated piece of machinery like an airplane really is not all that distant from a complicated thing like a carousel. And another reason I think this might be of interest to you is because there are several women play a very prominent part in the story. Well, anyway, to begin, our story begins in 1913. Now, in 1913, the airplane was not even a full 10 years old yet. And there were a lot of individuals who were aviation enthusiasts that wanted to do what they could to promote aviation because they felt it had great potential, which we know today they were right. But one of the ways in which they did this was through air races. And so in 1913, a fellow by the name of Schneider sponsored an air race. Now, Schneider was a Frenchman. It sounds like it should be Herr Schneider, but actually it was Monsieur Schneider. And he promoted this air race. It was to be held annually. It was an international race where one nation would compete against another. The winner of the race got a small cash prize, but they also got this got to keep the Schneider trophy for a year. Then at the end of the year, the nation that won would be the host nation for the next race. They'd pass the trophy on to the next winner, and so on. This was a race for seaplanes. These were planes which could take off and land from water. And this is really a pretty remarkable looking trophy.
What in the heck is it?
This is not too good a picture, but this is a nymph or an angel with wings, and she is hovering over an ocean wave. And this is to signify the union between the airplane and landing on water. This is the spirit of the air, and if you had a good picture of this, you could see that embedded in the waves there are 4 faces sticking out, and this represents Neptune and his 3 sons. And if you do get a good look at it, that spirit of the air is pretty curvaceous, and she's mounted on top of this thing, and what holds her up there actually, or the only contact between she and the rest of the trophy, is the fact that she's kissing the face, which is emerging from the waves. It's rather sensuous, and so that in itself lets you know that Schneider really was French and not German. See, she's kissing. And there's a head there, one there, one there.
The 4 heads are right up here. This is her
That's what I
feet up
expected.
there.
Oh, the crest of the wave, yes. This is her feet. And
That
the
was an
wings
equally
are
good
spreading
story.
out on either side. Okay, one of the stipulations of the race was that if any nation won this race 3 times within a period of 5 years, then they would get to keep the trophy. It would be retired, and that would be the end of the Schneider races. And so the first year this was held was 1913, and it was won by a Frenchman at the speed, now hold your breath, for this race was 45 miles an hour in an airplane.
How could something stay aloft at 45 miles an hour?
Second year, 1914, it was won by the British in this Sopwith seaplane. And to give you an idea of how much progress was being made within a year, 1913 it was at 45 miles an hour. A year later, this was almost 87 miles an hour, so it had almost doubled within 2 years. Now, these races were to be held every year, but World War I came along and they were postponed, of course, while the war was going on, and they were not held again until 1920. And in 1920, Italy won the race. And in 1921, Italy won again. And so, one more win, and they would retire the trophy. Well, everybody was working frantically because there was a lot of national prestige associated with this. They were working to try to prevent this, and sure enough, the following year, England won the trophy. And the year after that, it was the United States that won. That was in 1923. In 24, they didn't have a race because nobody could get an airplane ready in time. But in 1925, they raced and the United States won again for the second time in a row. And this is a picture of the United States entry that year and the winning pilot. And his name is Jimmy Doolittle. He was an Army man. And he went on to win even greater fame in World War II when he led that first bombing mission against the Japanese home islands, where they took off in the Army 2-engine bombers from the aircraft carriers and bombed the homeland of Japan. Well, here we are again. Now, if the United States wins again, they will permanently hold the trophy. And so several countries started working frantically to try to keep that from happening. But in the meantime, another strange event took place. Maybe it isn't so strange, but the United States Congress said, hey, we're tired of putting money into racing planes. We're not going to give you any financial support. And so without this support to develop new planes, new engines, the United States really did not have a competitor in the next race, and the race was won by Italy. We did not have an entry. In 1927, they decided that they would hold the race every other year because planes were getting so complex that you couldn't develop new ones from one year to the next. But in 1927, the race was won by England. A racing plane designed by a fellow named R.J. Mitchell. He was the chief designer for a company called the Supermarine Company. And they made or designed and built these big flying boats, big, cumbersome, clumsy things. But they took a flyer on building a small, single-engine racing plane. And they won in 1927. In 1929, the next time it was run, he tweaked his design, got all the horsepower he could out of the engines that were available at the time, and they won again. So the next race was to be held in 1931. And here again, all England had to do was win one more time and retire the trophy. But then history repeated itself, only this time in England, and the British Parliament said, we're not going to give you any more money for racing. But at this point, a lady by the name of Lucy Houston, and I say a lady because she was Lady Lucy Houston, she put up the money to fund a new racer and develop a new engine for the Schneider Cup races. She said, well, her purpose was to castigate England's Labour government for, I quote, the poisonous doctrine that we are a third-rate power. I'm proud to say I inherit the spirit of my forefathers, who considered one Englishman equal to any 3 foreigners. We are not worms to be trampled under the heel of socialism, but true Britons with a heart or any fate. Every true Briton would rather sell his last shirt than admit that England could not afford to defend herself. Now, she donated something like 100,000 pounds to develop this new racer, and in that time that was worth just a little bit less than $500,000. These are 1931 dollars, when $500,000 is still a whole lot back in 32, my dad was working for $100 a month and supporting a family. So 400 and some odd thousand dollars, it was quite a chunk of money she put into this venture. Well, with that influx of money, incidentally, this is a picture of Lady Houston at the races where she's going down to meet the winning pilot of the airplane.
How did she get her money, do you know?
She was a wealthy widow. Her husband was in shipping. Lord Houston was had some interest in shipping. I'm not exactly sure what he did. But
Got it the old-fashioned way, she inherited it.
Yeah.
anyway, this is a picture of the Supermarine racer that won the trophy for the third time in a row. It retired the trophy to Great Britain, and everyone lived happily ever after. And if it hadn't been for Lady Houston, this would never have taken place. Now, this was 1939, remember, and shortly after this, or even at that time, war clouds were beginning to build up over Europe. And although they were forbidden to have an air force, according to the terms of the Versailles Treaty, nevertheless, Germany was building up an air force. And by the time World War II started in 1939, they had the finest air force in the world, the finest airplanes in the world. This is a picture of a German fighter plane. This plane first flew in 1935. And it may not look like it's too streamlined or too much of a breakthrough now, but remember this was 70 years ago that this plane was designed, and this was the finest thing in the world at the time. To give you an idea of how advanced this was, I'm going to show you a picture of the airplane it replaced. This is a fighter that any of the aces from World War I would have felt very comfortable with this airplane. It was covered in fabric, it had two wings, a biplane, it was braced with wires, the wheels stuck out in the wind. So this Messerschmitt was a real breakthrough. Now, these developments are not made in a void. They seem to move in parallel. And so a number of countries were working on newer, more modern airplanes. And the British decided that if they were going to keep up with the Germans, they better do something to modernize their air force also. And so they put out a specification, and this plane is a plane made by Hawker, the Hawker Hurricane. And I wanted to mention, since Ann is here tonight, that's the same company that where Raytheon assembles the Hawker jets here in Little Rock today. It's the same outfit that built the Hawker Hurricane back in the mid-1930s. And so this was the British answer to the Messerschmitt. Now this plane wasn't, well, a Hurricane pilot would argue with you, but most people would admit that this plane was not up to snuff with the Messerschmitt. It wasn't as fast, didn't have as good an armament, but nevertheless, that's what the British had. This is a picture of a British plane that it replaced. Again, an old biplane fighter with wires between the wings and a fixed landing gear. Now, by the time World War II started in 1939, the Germans were fully equipped with that Messerschmitt fighter, and it had been combat tested in the Spanish Civil War. Many of the British squadrons still had this old Gloucester fighter when World War II began. It and the Hurricane, a few Hurricanes, but mainly this Gloucester fighter. And when Germany went over and invaded France, and the British Expeditionary Force was fighting in France, that's what they used were the Hurricanes and the Gloucester Gladiators, they were called. Just couldn't keep up with the German modern Messerschmitt. But in the meantime, our old friend R.J. Mitchell said, you know, I got experience working with these racing planes. I think I can design a fighter plane. And he did. And it turned out to be the Supermarine Spitfire, which was exactly on par with the Messerschmitt. It was a very fine airplane. And both of these airplanes, the Messerschmitt and the Spitfire, are considered to be just classic aircraft designs. Both of them lasted throughout the entire World War II. But this is his fighter. It went on to make a great name for itself in the Battle of Britain. Now, the Battle of Britain started in the late summer of 1940. Remember, at that time, all of Europe except for England was under German domination. And Hitler was going to invade England. And most people agree that if that invasion had taken place, it would have been successful, because the British had lost most of their equipment at Dunkirk when they left the European continent. So before he could invade, he had to get control of the air. And thinking that their planes were far superior to anything that the British had, they didn't see any big problem. And so they started trying to wear down the British Air Force, but to make a long story short and not take up the whole night talking about the Battle of Britain, the British put up a tremendous effort. The Germans found it to be very costly. They were not able to sustain the losses that the British were giving them. The British showed no sign whatsoever of running out of planes and pilots, although they came very, very close. And Germany was not able to win this air superiority, so they had to call off the invasion. And so many people attribute the winning of World War II, actually, to the fact that the Spitfires and the Hurricanes put up such a gallant fight. And this is why the Spitfire today is thought of so highly in England. It's almost venerated by the people of England. It is the symbol of the Battle of Britain. Now, there were more Hurricanes than Spitfires, but the Spitfire caught the imagination of the people. There were more Hurricanes simply because the Hurricane came out a year before the Spitfire did. And when the war actually began in 1939,